A mysterious disease is sweeping through my hometown. It seems to only affect the kids. As we stepped into the hospital, my gaze scanned the waiting area, filled with families and their young ones. I caught a glimpse of a few children, their eyes reflecting a bizarre crimson shade, reminiscent of poorly processed vintage photos. My own daughter, Juliana, was displaying the same unnerving symptoms as these kids. Yet, there wasn't a whisper about it in the local news. However, whispers of an infectious disease started making rounds, solely affecting the young ones, for the moment. The nurse on duty took a good look at us, scribbling something down. I handed over our identification, including my Proteon Company ID, and stepped back, anticipating her queries. "Symptoms?" she inquired. Crimson eyes, laughter at odd times, and peculiar remarks. "Any unusual cravings?" I swallowed hard, my mind flashing back to what Juliana had said at breakfast that morning. "Not at all," I fibbed. The nurse stared at me for a moment before jotting something down and asking the next question. "How long have these symptoms been present?" "Since this morning." The red eyes started appearing around 20 minutes ago. That's when I decided to bring her here. She handed Juliana a wristband, indicating us to wait to be called in. The wristband chimed electronically, revealing 2 green lights beside the Proteon Company logo, the megacorporation managing our technologically advanced town. I had initially thought Pleasant Hills, my workplace, was a utopia to raise a family. The salary and perks made the decision seem like a no-brainer. But now, I was realizing that this charming town had its secrets. A mysterious disease was making its way through the population, something I hadn't witnessed or heard of before. As we settled into the waiting room, Juliana started showing interest in the toys and books. Ignoring my calls, she started going through a colorful children's book. A woman near us quickly retreated as if a leper was approaching. I felt a surge of anger, but I realized it wasn't her fault. We were all scared, grappling with the unknown. Juliana, unfazed by the woman's reaction, kept flipping through the book, her crimson eyes scanning the text rapidly. She sensed the woman's lingering gaze, returned a glare, and then, to my shock, hissed at her, baring her teeth. I leaped to pull her back. "Juliana! Stop! What are you doing?" She shrugged off the incident and returned to her book, while the terrified woman fled the room. "She's got it too." I looked across the room to see a man with his kids. They looked like they were returning from a church service, but their expressions were off. They stared at me with eerie, vacant smiles. Their eyes were glossed over, and their teeth seemed unusually sharp. These changes were subtle but indisputable. Yes, I too noticed the changes today. God help us all. "How long have your children?" Juliana Winters, a feminine voice echoed from the ER entrance, cutting our conversation short. Juliana Winters? Swiftly, I rose, clutching her hand. She clung onto her book. "Apologies," she seized it before I could stop her, I explained to the nurse, indicating the book. She seemed unfazed. "Hold on to it." Donning a breathing mask, gloves, goggles, and a vivid blue protective suit, she escorted us to a room. The door read, "Negative pressure room." "Should I have a mask?" I inquired as she exited. "Perhaps. But exposure is likely inevitable now. The doctor will see you soon." "Exposed to what?" I bellowed. The door closed with a hiss and thud. The woman, outside, disrobed her protective gear, but didn't acknowledge us or answer my query. A large window at the room's front gave us a view into the ER. She vanished into the throng of medical staff and patients. Left in silence, Juliana reopened her book and settled cross-legged on the floor. I wanted to warn her off the potentially contaminated ground, but her innocence in that moment stopped me. She seemed normal again, like herself. Aside from the red eyes, glowing as she peered at me. Suddenly, the PA system blared. A distressed woman's voice spoke. "Code Crimson in effect. Code Crimson in effect. All security personnel to the emergency waiting area immediately." The message repeated twice more, then the speaker silenced. "What's a Code Crimson, Daddy?" Juliana asked, looking up from her book. "Is it a fire?" "I don't think so, honey. I think this is something different. Just keep reading your story." A shrill scream came from outside the room and I looked out through the large window into the ER. For a few seconds there was nothing. My heart pounded dully in my ears and I could feel it in my throat as I gulped down a dry lump. A woman in pale green scrubs raced past, blood shooting from a fresh wound on her arm, spraying the wall red as she ran by. She was screaming and looking over her shoulder, sprinting like her life depended on it. Gunfire could be heard from down the hall, in the waiting area where we had just been. "Get down!" I yelled at Juliana, running over to her. "Someone's shooting!" I ran over to my daughter and pulled her behind a chair which was up against the wall. The two of us hid behind it and I heard people running past outside, but was too afraid to look. The gunfire was constant now, and getting closer. I could hear things breaking outside the room from stray bullets and just hoped one wouldn't find its way to us. "Daddy, I'm hungry," Juliana said quietly. "Not now, honey, please." How could she be thinking of food at a time like this, I wondered to myself. More gunshots rang out, sounding very close now. I ventured a glance out from behind the chair we were using as cover. Through the glass, I saw men in black body armor with machine guns in their hands. They were firing rapidly and backing up, moving away from the waiting area. Security Enforcement Officer was written on each of their uniforms, with their name beneath that. I recoiled in surprise as something leapt through the air like a wild animal, tackling one of the security guards and sending him flying backwards, his gun firing as he fell. His repeated screams were heard muffled through the door a few seconds later. It was the children with red eyes. Dozens of them from the waiting room were now rampaging throughout the ER, chasing nurses and doctors, running around on all fours like animals. A few people were on the ground and the children appeared to be feeding on them, ripping out their throats and feasting on their bloody flesh. The power suddenly shut off with a dull click and the ER was cast into total darkness for several long moments. "I'm so hungry, Daddy," Juliana said from behind me, moving closer. The emergency lighting switched on and everything was cast in a dim glow from above. I spun around to see my daughter moving towards me, a hungry look in her eyes. She was smiling like a hungry piranha and I could see her teeth growing insidiously longer, drawing into needle-sharp points. "What are you doing, Juliana? Stop. Don't get any closer." I felt as if I shouldn't let her know how scared I was. If she could sense my fear, I worried she would lunge at me like a wild animal. Something slammed into the glass behind me and I spun around to see a teenage boy smashing his forehead repeatedly against the window, his eyes ablazing, burning red. The glass began to spiderweb and slowly crack from its center, and I heard it crunching and breaking from each impact as he bashed his skull against the window again and again. I was so caught up in the sight of it that I almost missed the reflection of my daughter lunging at me from behind. But I saw it at the last second and ducked out of the way, surprised at my own quick instincts. The glass shattered as she crashed into it and went flying through, landing hard against the boy on the other side. Something was wrong with them. Something very, very wrong. And my fight or flight instinct suddenly took over, more specifically, my flight instinct. I leapt through the broken window, broken glass piercing my palms, and began to run back towards the waiting room. When I looked back, I saw my daughter and the teenage boy were scrambling to their feet, racing towards me on all fours like jungle cats, their eyes blazing red. The horrible sight of them chasing me distracted me from my route and I found myself slipping in fresh blood, sliding and wrenching my back as I fell down in the middle of a sticky red puddle. I hit the ground hard and bit my tongue, tasting coppery blood a second later. "Stay down," someone screamed behind them and began to fire. Thankfully, I saw they weren't shooting bullets. Small syringes full of green fluid impacted nearby, missing them. But a few found their targets and the two of them turned around, racing back towards their attacker. Their movements weren't even slowed by the heavy dose of tranquilizer. The man screamed as the two of them took him down, tearing off his black body armor and feeding on his flesh a second later. He screamed in pain and yelled at me to run. After a moment's hesitation, I began to sprint back towards the entrance where we'd come in. A pair of sliding steel doors separated the waiting area from the ER. I raced towards them and began to hammer my fists against them, screaming to be let out. Looking up to my left, I saw a security camera pointed at me. "I haven't been bit," I screamed, thinking for some reason that might be important. Maybe I'd just seen one too many zombie movies. "Please, let me out." Maybe that was the right thing to say, since the doors opened and I burst through them a second later. Two security guards in heavy armor were on the other side. They were closing the door as I looked back through and saw my daughter racing towards us, blood smeared around her mouth like strawberry jam. Then the steel doors slammed shut. "My daughter's in there," I screamed. "We've gotta help her." Something impacted the steel door on the other side, deforming the metal and bending it into the shape of a child's skull. "It's us you should be worried about," the security guard said. I looked around and saw the hospital was being sealed. Thick steel shutters were closing slowly and blocking out the sun, casting the waiting room into semi-darkness. "Code Crimson in effect," a robotic voice said from overhead. "Shelter in place and do not approach the infected. Do not attempt to reason with the infected or to speak with them. Do not make eye contact. Assistance is on the way. Do not panic." Another loud bang came from the steel door separating the waiting room from the ER, and I saw a gap was forming, big enough to see through. And I peered through, looking familiar, except for the color of it, crimson like a sunset. "Peekaboo, Daddy," my daughter said, giggling. "I see you." The day I revealed why I fear puppets. My mother was well aware of my deep-seated aversion towards puppets. My fear had been ingrained from early on, but she merely assumed it was due to their uncanny human-like appearance. She rarely probed, as I was the sort of child who'd prefer to evade rather than confront a fear, seldom being easily spooked, and prone to lash out if surprised. I'd always been this way, a trait that has carried on into my adulthood. During an animated conversation with my friends on Discord last year, my mother overheard my vociferous declaration of my loathing for puppets and the profound terror they induced in me. Her surprise was justified. It was rare for me to confess to any fear, especially with such vehemence. That night, before retiring, she engaged me in a quiet conversation about my irrational dread. Initially puzzled, I then realized I hadn't ever disclosed the reason. To paint a picture, our previous house was structured such that a flight of 2 steps led to a small platform. From there, one could either descend 2 steps straight to the bathroom or turn right and ascend 11 steps to a small landing. 2 storage rooms were located to the right of this landing, which eventually became my room and that of my foster sister. The master bedroom, complete with an ensuite and terrace, was situated to the left. I used to bunk with my mother in this room when I was little. The light switch was right next to the door, but at my diminutive size, I had to clamber onto a chair by the dresser or attempt a leap in the darkened room to reach the switch. I must have been between 6 and 8 when this incident occurred. After an afternoon of play with the neighborhood kids, I returned home for a bath. Following a quick refreshment, I made my way up the stairs. My mother was at work, and the babysitter had stepped out. I distinctly remember being the only one home. As I approached the landing, I was met with a sight that halted me in my tracks, a puppet sitting in a carriage. This puppet was the only one my mother had ever bought me. It had several features that made it creepy. Firstly, it was almost my size, with unmanageable, curly brown hair, and came with a carriage that was once my size. Secondly, it was the kind of puppet whose eyes open when picked up. Lastly, it had eerie glowing eyes, I can't fathom what the creators were thinking, but the puppet's eyes would luminesce a ghastly green in the dark. I've had multiple jarring encounters where I'd stumble over it in the dark, with its eyes lighting up from the floor. My mother was fond of it, though. I, on the other hand, wasn't. Back to the puppet. It was sitting in the carriage, hands by its side, eyes shut, parked before the storage room. I eyed it apprehensively, praying that it wouldn't open its eyes, before reminding myself that it wouldn't. No one was around to move it, and the landing wasn't high enough to trigger its eyes opening. I proceeded left into the master bedroom. It was around 6 to 7 p.m., hence the room was shrouded in darkness. An odd sensation prickled at the back of my neck, but I shrugged it off. I made a few unsuccessful attempts at hitting the light switch, owing to my short stature. When I finally managed to hit it, I was taken aback as the lights remained off. I assumed that I had accidentally hit it twice, so I entered the room, shutting the door behind me. As the room plunged into darkness, the unsettling sensation intensified. Despite the dark, I could discern silhouettes. Something was behind me. Whirling around, I found myself staring at a massive wardrobe. Atop it sat a blonde puppet. In the dimness, I saw its arms move from its sides to the front. Fear began to grip me as I hoped I was merely imagining things. Then its eyes opened. Bright, dazzling blue eyes stared directly at me as they grew closer and closer. The realization hit me hard, and I found myself sprawled on the floor, my head thudding against the hardwood. I was looking into the puppet's eerie blue eyes, an image that would forever remain etched in my memory. Its plastic hands were around my neck, pressing down, becoming increasingly constricting as it came closer to my face. I remember crying and trying to push it away. I was convinced I could do it, as these puppets were lightweight, designed with hollow interiors so that children could carry them. But this one, while not feeling heavy, was exerting pressure on my neck. After a few minutes of struggle, I managed to push it off. I sprinted out of the master bedroom and halted at the landing. The brown-haired puppet was still there, its carriage wheels creaking as it slowly moved towards me. Its arms, which were by its side, were now slowly rising, reaching out for me. Its green eyes rolled up slowly, focusing on me. As it drew nearer, I jumped down the stairs, avoiding being cornered. The ensuing events are hazy. I recall crying and rushing to a neighbor's house. They didn't believe me, as far as I remember, but I am glad they didn't tease me about it. I finished my story, somewhat shaken by the recollection. My mother remained silent, a look of confusion etched on her face. Throughout the story, she had been paying rapt attention, nodding along. But she did appear genuinely puzzled. I gave her a moment to process it before asking about her confusion. She met my gaze. I remember the brown-haired puppet. I bought it for you. I know. You never played with it, you disliked it. Yes. I wasn't sure where she was going with this. For a moment, I feared it would lead to another lecture about how I was different from other girls my age. But instead, she gave me a look of concern. I never bought you a blonde puppet. When I was a child, I loved the game of hide and seek. It was thrilling, the unpredictability, the suspense. The feeling of adrenaline coursing through your veins when you're the last one hiding and all your friends are seeking you out. Little did I know that years later, I'd be playing the same game. Only this time, my life was at stake. It all started when I moved into an old house in the countryside. It was a quaint place, with creaky floors and a homely charm. The only odd thing was a large antique mirror that hung in my room. I was always drawn to it, its allure was almost hypnotic. And then, one day, it happened. As I stood before the mirror, brushing my hair, I could see someone else in the mirror. He was a middle-aged man, dressed in what seemed to be clothes from the Victorian era. He smiled, revealing a set of unnaturally sharp teeth. I screamed and ran, but every mirror in the house showed the same man. One day, I gathered the courage to talk to him. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man gave a bow, the smirk never leaving his face. "Why, I am the enchanter, dear one." "Enchanter of what?" I pressed on. "I am the enchanter who traps souls in mirrors," he replied, his voice melodious, yet chilling. I gasped. "Why?" "Because I can," he answered simply. "Are you going to trap my soul too?" I asked, my heart pounding. "That depends," he replied, "on whether you can be of use to me." "Use? How?" I stuttered. The enchanter explained his plight. He was stuck in the mirror realm because of a curse cast upon him by a witch. Only a pure soul could break the curse by willingly allowing him to trap them in the mirror. "If you help me," he said, "I promise to set you free as soon as I am free." It was a devil's deal. But I was desperate and scared. So I did it. I let the enchanter trap my soul into the mirror. The mirror realm was dark and twisted. Time was non-existent here, and I was alone, trapped in a dark void with no company but my own thoughts. I screamed, I cried, I begged for release, but the enchanter was nowhere to be seen. And then, one day, he came. He had kept his promise. He was free and so was I. My soul returned to my body, but I was not the same. The experience had changed me. Now, years later, I've noticed the enchanter is not completely gone. Sometimes, late at night, I see his smirk in the mirrors, I hear his melodious voice in my dreams, whispering of darkness and despair. So, enchanter, if you can hear me, I seek your help. I've done my part of the deal, now do yours. Release me fully. Let me go. Please. Ever since I started working in the clock tower, I've always had a sense of impending doom. I suppose that's normal when your job revolves around time ticking away. I just never thought that the feeling would become so literal. It started innocuously enough. The clock hands began to stutter and jerk in a way that wasn't usual. I thought it was just the old mechanics starting to give up the ghost, but then I noticed the pattern. The hands would point to certain hours of the day, seemingly random. But as I started jotting them down, a correlation began to emerge. The hours and minutes they pointed at were representative of significant dates and times in my life. 7:15, the time of my birth. 3:18, the day I first met my wife. 11:09, the time of my father's death. I mumbled to myself one night, eyes wide as I scanned my list of notes. The realization felt like ice spreading through my veins. My heart pounded in my chest as the truth sunk in. The clock wasn't just telling time. It was telling my time. But it didn't stop there. Soon enough, it started predicting future events. The day my son was born, the clock pointed exactly to 5:27, his exact time of birth. "John, is everything okay?" My wife, Laura, asked me when I called her from the tower to confirm the birth time. "Yes, I paused, unsure of how to explain. "Just double-checking. Love you." This was amazing, but terrifying too. The accuracy was uncanny, and it filled me with a sense of foreboding. Especially when it predicted a car crash I was involved in, down to the minute. It's been a few months since that accident, but I can't shake the dread. The last time I checked, the clock hands were pointing to a date not too far in the future. And then, they stopped. Completely. I felt my heart stop too. I've been living in constant fear since then, fear of that fateful day and what it could possibly bring. I think the clock is predicting my death, and I don't know how to stop it. I wish I could just shrug it off, laugh at my absurd thoughts. But I've seen the clock's accuracy. I've seen it predict the future. I can't ignore it, even if I wanted to. So, here I am, sharing my story. Maybe someone here can help me understand what's happening. Maybe someone knows how to stop this. Maybe it's just a crazy mechanic of this old clock tower, or maybe it's some supernatural entity I can't fathom. But I need to find an answer before time runs out. For me.